right. Good afternoon again, and thank you for joining us today for the release of Beaver County Data Analysis 2026 Update, the latest report from the Ohio River Valley Institute and our fourth investigation of Beaver County's economic performance since the announcement of Shell's petrochemical complex in 2012. My name is Ben Hunkler. I'm the communications manager at ORVI. Our organization is a nonpartisan regional think tank working to chart a course toward clean energy, shared prosperity, and more equitable civic structures. We're joined today by report author and ORVI research fellow Eric DePlace, who will shortly walk us through the key findings and implications of today's report. And co-author and research fellow Julia Stone isn't able to join us today, but we are very grateful to her for her role in this report and ongoing analyses. Before we get started, I want to note that today's webinar is being recorded and closed captions should be available to you at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to add questions, thoughts, or comments in the chat or Q&A box at any time, and we will get to those after Eric's presentation. We will also send around a link to the recording of today's webinar, a copy of our slide deck, and a link to the report and a summary later this afternoon. Please send me a chat if you need anything, and otherwise, Eric, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it. Um, thanks to everyone who's on the call today. I really appreciate your time. I know time is, in some ways, the most scarce resource we have. So I appreciate you spending time here. And I wanted to just extend my gratitude to a few different folks. The first one is everyone who cares about Beaver County. Beaver County's been really in the spotlight for the last many years over the particular issue that we'll talk today. And I just wanted to express my gratitude to everyone who takes Beaver County seriously and is rooting for it to succeed. Also, thanks to the whole ORVI team, especially Ben, who's managing the webinar today. This, of course, could not happen without all the good folks at ORVI and the fantastic suite of research that organization produces across a whole range of issues, some of which inspired me in a very direct way to conduct this set of analyses, which I'll get into in just a moment. And then lastly, I wanted to thank my co-author and researcher, Julia Stone, who, as Ben mentioned, is not able to be here today, but she did a lot of the heavy lifting for this report, and so she deserves a good chunk of the credit. And with that being said, let's dig into what is now the fourth installment of a spotlight look at the economic performance of Beaver County. And just to say, before we get into some of the findings here, which you'll see on the screen already, Beaver County is very important to thinking about the U.S. petrochemical industry. The reason it's very important is because it provides us with a clear before and after picture of what happens when a large petrochemical facility is sited in a place. Prior to 2012, there was no such facility. After 2012, as we'll see in a second, there was at least a firm announcement that a project would be built there. And the project was attracted to Beaver County in large part because of a number of very specific promises that the industry made and that many policymakers at the state and local level believed would come true. And so now what we're able to do is we're able to look back at Beaver County's economic performance. We're not looking at the health of the petrochemical industry. We're not necessarily looking at the health of Shell, which is the owner of the facility in Beaver County, but we're going to look at what happens locally when a large facility like this is sited. And what we have found when we look at Beaver County periodically is that by nearly every single measure of economic health, Beaver County is losing ground. It's losing ground relative to where it was in the past. It's losing ground relative to Pennsylvania. It's losing ground relative to the neighboring counties around it, and it's losing ground relative to the nation as a whole. That's pretty depressing news in a lot of ways. I don't think it's particularly surprising because it turns out to be the case that large petrochemical facilities don't actually improve local economic conditions. They do provide a small number of jobs once the project is operating. They do provide some temporary construction jobs, but on net, over time, the impacts do not appear to be positive, and there's very, very little reason to think that that investment in Beaver County was a positive investment. If anything, it probably drained resources from the county. But before I get too far ahead of myself, let's dig into the contents here and we'll walk through a whole suite of measurements in order to kind of provide the evidentiary support for what I'm saying. But this is helpful as we go through. We're going to go through a whole bunch of graphs and charts, but this will make the the charts and graphs a lot more intelligible. There are some key milestones with respect to the Shell ethane cracker in Beaver County. Number one is 2012, and it was in 2012 that Shell first announced that it would definitely construct its ethane cracker in Beaver County. So it's at that point that local businesses, other businesses can begin to make clear decisions about what they want to do in Beaver County. So we're going to benchmark everything to 2012, and you'll see economic performance measured against that milestone because it's at that point when people can start making decisions. 2015, groundbreaking at the site begins. 2016, Shell makes the final investment decision announcement. 2017 is the beginning of major construction. And by 2022, the facility has become operational. Here we are, mid 2026, hard to believe. And so we now have a little bit of time to look back and see the long-term trends, but we'll bear some of these key dates in mind as we look at the charts and graphs. First and most important, the highest level performance indicator, gross domestic product. Most people are familiar with what this means. It's the total of all goods and services sold in a location. And let's take a look at the chart, Ben. And what we see here, we'll see the same color scheme in all these charts. That sort of darker small dash line is what happened to US GDP since 2012. Everyone's benchmarked to zero in 2012. Since 2012, the US GDP has grown by about 34%. Pennsylvania, the sort of lighter blue dashed line in the middle there, has grown by about 16.5%, again, since 2012. What's happened in Beaver County, unfortunately, is quite the opposite. The Beaver County GDP totals have dropped by about 16.5% since that project was first announced. And if you look at the orange line at the bottom there, where Beaver County is, you'll see that it's not a steady linear decline. There's a bump there around 2018 to 2020. And you'll see this same bump reflected in many of the economic indicators. What that bump is, that is reflecting the temporary construction period. When people are on site at the plant, building that plant, you do see a ramp up in economic activity. You'll see that reflected in other indicators too. And then once the plant is largely completed and heading into operations, the line begins to drop again. And we're now in a place where Beaver County has fairly radically underperformed itself, the state, and the nation in terms of the macro indicator GDP. We'll go to the next slide if that's all right. This one then takes a look at other counties nearby for which GDP is available as a measurement. So there have been some folks who have suggested, well, if the Shell cracker plant were not built in Beaver County, the economic performance might have been even worse. It's a sort of a strange argument in some ways because it's a hypothetical that nobody could know the answer to. But what we decided to do was take a look at GDP performance in this suite of counties nearby. I don't need to read all of those to you, but you can see here that actually Beaver County has done worse than almost every other county in the neighborhood. Again, for which GDP is available, it's hard to get. For very small counties, it's hard to get. Like Greene County, it's hard to get accurate GDP information. So this seems to indicate that what's happening in Beaver County is happening in a way that's more problematic than it is in other places in the same region. And we'll go to the next slide now. Population, not a traditional measure of economic health, but certainly a measure of overall health and at least one barometer of what's going on in a place. If we go to the slide with the graph on it, again, you'll see the same indicators. US GDP or population, as measured by the Census Bureau, has increased by about 8.5% since 2012. Pennsylvania, it's a more modest increase, but things have been a bit stronger in recent years. It's up 2.5% since 2012. And Beaver County down by about the same amount over that period. And again, you can see that kind of population bump during the temporary construction period, but Beaver County has not recovered to anywhere near the level it had in 2012. We can keep going to the next slide. Employment. So the US government measures local employment in a couple of different ways. The first one we're going to look at is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which publishes a business survey. It's called the QCEW. We don't need to worry about all the terminology necessarily. The report contains lots and lots of methodology for folks who want to geek out on it. I'm happy to do that too. But this is basically tracking jobs that are covered by unemployment insurance. So this is the employer-reported data, which is part of the state unemployment program, and we'll go look at the chart here in a second. And what we see is, unfortunately, a pretty similar story. So Beaver County employment is down by 11%, a little more than 11%. Um, and it has, you can see the temporary construction kind of increase in the middle of the time series there, and it's been flat for the last couple of years, but still not exactly a strong performance indicator relative to where Pennsylvania up 8.5% and the United States up 18% are over that same period. Let's go to the next one. And again, what we did here to sort of address this question of, well, maybe Beaver County would have been even worse if the cracker had not been built there. So we took a look again at the same suite of neighboring counties. And what we find is that Beaver County doesn't particularly do very well. It's not the bottom of the barrel, but it's not the top of the barrel either, and it's actually below the median. So it's really hard to look at an indicator like this and think, well, gosh, that the cracker really had an outsized positive impact. If anything, it appears to have had a negative impact on net. Let's cruise to the next one, which is a different way of looking at jobs and employment. This one is uses the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's the local area unemployment statistics. And what I'm going to do in the course of this presentation is to talk about indicators, but we're going to look at sort of every consistent way to measure these so that we're not getting a biased perspective. The industry will often pick one or two random facts and try to cite those over and over again. What we're trying to do in this report is to take a look at the same thing from multiple angles, and that helps us determine whether or not what we're seeing is an accurate reflection. And once again, with this measure of jobs, we see pretty much the same story. So US is up by almost 15%, Pennsylvania up by almost 5%, Beaver County down by almost 2% over the same period. So again, not exactly a great ratification of what's going on in Beaver County. Now we're going to take a look at business firms and establishments. And the reason this is important is because one of the core promises that Shell made and that the backers of this project made was that if you built the Shell cracker plant in Beaver County, it would create an upswelling of new business investment and new businesses locating near the cracker to take advantage of those products or to serve the workers there or other things like that. And what we've seen in reality is quite the opposite. So go to the next slide if you would, Ben. So there's a couple different ways to measure this. Without going into the methodological details, this is a measurement that comes from the U.S. Census Bureau. It's a survey-based approach to U.S. businesses. So in the number of firms who are located in Beaver County, you see that there's been a decline. Now, there has been a small increase since 2020, which is encouraging, but it's still down more than 3% since that project was first announced, continued to decline, not quite uniformly, but declined all through final investment decision and construction and so forth. That's quite a poor showing relative to the state, where it's up 2.5%, and to the US overall, which is up almost 12% over that same period. So we're really not seeing strong growth in businesses. Another way to look at this would be this is the number of establishments, which is a slightly different measurement. So this is looking at essentially at storefronts rather than at the number of sort of tax-paying firms. But it's the same story basically. Beaver County is down about 2%. Pennsylvania's up in a modest but strong way. U.S. is up quite a lot. So you're not seeing the promises materialize in Beaver County. Now we're going to continue to measure this stuff. I think there's some hope that over time we could see businesses start to return to Beaver County. I doubt it's because of the cracker plant, but we'll see what happens in the future. You can go to the next slide, Ben. And again, this one is yet another measurement of the number of businesses present in a county. This one from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And again, you're seeing pretty similar results. And again, I won't go into all the methodology just so I don't spend 45 minutes yammering at folks in the webinar. But it is interesting, in my view, to take different survey instruments and different statistical instruments to look at the same sort of underlying trend. And when they all are telling the same story, you start to become confident that this is in fact what's going on. Beaver County down 4% since the project was announced, and with decline since construction. And this one too, we took a look at the neighboring counties, and what you see here is that Beaver County looks pretty much exactly like the counties around it. There are some outliers. Cambria County did quite poorly. Butler County did quite well. But you're not seeing something happening in Beaver County from the perspective of business establishments. That's a lot different from the neighboring county. So it's to me, it's hard to make the case that whatever happened as a result of the shell cracker, it made a huge difference that could not have been achieved um, in other counties through other means. Let's go to the next slide. So, poverty and child poverty, obviously, key indicators of economic performance, especially for those folks who may be struggling. For those who don't know, there are federally defined poverty lines for households based on income levels. Those income levels are set nationwide. And so, what we're going to look at in these slides is a look at how Beaver County has done relative to poverty and child poverty rates. Now, in this slide, unlike the others, generally we want employment to go up, we want businesses to go up, we want GDP to go up. In this case, down is good. So I assume we would all like poverty rates to be lower, and that's been a positive trend nationally and in Pennsylvania. We really have seen modest but real declines in poverty. But at Beaver County, the declines are happening, but they're much smaller, much more modest. And so where Beaver County used to have a much lower poverty rate than the state or the US, that's no longer true. Now they're just about the same. And for the data nerds who may be on the phone, you will notice that that orange line is a little jagged. It kind of bounces around a lot. And that's just because the measurement instrument for poverty is a little bit crude at the county level. And so you get some more natural fluctuation in the data presentation than you do at, say, the national level. So we think this is an accurate picture, but there's some error bars on that orange line that you might not see at a larger geographic scale. And we can go to the next slide. This is simply a different way, a different Census Bureau statistical instrument for measuring poverty. Again, some jaggedness in that orange line, but the same story largely. What you see is that the advantage that Beaver County once had in poverty rates appears to have evaporated, and so the poverty rate at the county level is now essentially the same as it is at the state and national level. That was for child poverty in that case. I mix up this like child poverty in that case, but and this is the one that's the different survey instrument. This one comes from the American Community Survey, but again confirms what the other instrument shows, which is that the performance advantage that Beaver County used to have, a lower poverty rate, substantially lower, really has largely gone away, and so the poverty rates are now consistent with the state and national level. And again, when we look at child poverty using this same instrument, the American Community Survey, same story we saw with child poverty using the other one, where again, some fluctuation in that orange line, but because we're looking at multiple sources of information, I think we can be reasonably confident that this is reflecting reality. Beaver County's advantage in child poverty has largely disappeared at this point, maybe entirely disappeared. Let's look at income. This is important to everybody who's earning wages. There are a lot of different ways to measure income, as it turns out. I'm going to kind of cruise through these so as not to belabor the point, but we're going to look at a handful of these. And what you see is median income. So median income is the middle point in all of the income. So if we're thinking about the country, Elon Musk's income would be at the highest level, and somebody who earned $0 or negative dollars would be at the lowest, and you're looking for the person who's exactly in the middle. And what we see since 2012 is that Beaver County's median income has grown at a level that's really consistent with the state and national growth. That's I think a bright spot for Beaver County. It's nice to see median income going up. The picture will get a little more complicated as we go along, but I do think this is a place where Beaver County the performance is pretty solid. This one's looking at per capita income, a slightly different measure of income. So rather than looking at the 50th percentile, in this case, we're adding up all of the income that's produced, and then we're dividing it by the number of people. Beaver County, again, the growth is, it's pretty consistent with what's happening at the state level. It's a little behind the national level, but basically you're saying you're seeing sort of consistent income growth, per capita income growth at the county level. So, a reasonable showing for Beaver County. Let's go to the next one. And then this one is going to look at per capita income in a slightly different way. Um, I think this one's per capita personal income. Um, so this is counting wages, salaries, government benefits, dividends, interest, business income, and a few other sources of incomes. And this is often considered the most complete measurement. And by this look, Beaver County's fallen behind just a little bit. It's not a dramatic um, uh, loss of performance, but it's not great either. And what you can see is that in that sort of post-construction period, when the plant starts moving to operation, sort of between 2020, 21, 22, it kind of goes flat there for a bit, which I think is a worrisome sign that the underlying economy in Beaver County is not sufficient to quite keep pace with what's going on in other places. And we'll go to the next one here. So this one is market income, and this is a measurement that we've only been tracking now for this is the second year we've been tracking it. And so what this takes a look at is uh, this basically subtracts out government benefits and transfers. So you're going to subtract out things like Social Security benefits, unemployment benefits, welfare programs, Medicaid payments, veterans benefits, things like that, and you're going to look at just the income that is generated. From wages, from the earnings that you would have at a job. And so, and also from personal investments. And so this gives us a sense, again, when we look at this, that Beaver County's performance in like employment income and wages that are earned, that is not government benefits, it's tracking substantially below the US, but so is Pennsylvania. But it's fallen behind Pennsylvania a little bit, again, in that sort of like that period that's just through construction, COVID, and then post-construction, it hasn't caught up again. And so again, I think, not a sort of a final analysis, but a worrisome indicator that the structural economics in Beaver County with a petrochemical plant in place now are not sufficient to drive the growth that we might see in other places. And we can move to I think the last slide is next, if I'm not mistaken. So, the couple of things I like to say as I sort of wrap up my monologue here. This accounting is incomplete. It's always going to be incomplete because no one knows what the future is going to hold for Beaver County. We will go back and look at this periodically every year or so to see what's happened. No one will know for sure until we have the data. Um, uh, this also does not factor in a couple of key things. One is it does not factor in the generous state tax subsidies that were awarded to Shell to the tune of $1.65 billion, if I've got the figure right, that the state legislature enacted in order to attract that plant to Beaver County, largely on the strength of claims that it would drive economic prosperity, both in the region at the state level. It's really hard to see how that state tax subsidy, or those subsidies have actually achieved the growth that was promised. I'm sure not seeing it in the data. And it does not factor in the costs of operating that plant. There are costs of bright lights at a local facility, but more importantly, probably the costs of local air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions that have come from that facility. So if you're living near it or doing business near it, you are impacted, your health is impacted by that pollution. Those costs are not directly included, and they may be included in things like population, where people may be moving away because of the plant. But it's an important factor that isn't reflected, again, directly in economic statistics. We're going to keep our fingers crossed for Beaver County. I'm rooting for Beaver County and hopeful that the future will get brighter. But I do think at this point, now that we have almost 4 years of data, or it's been almost 4 years since the plant has begun operation, it's become pretty clear that the county is not achieving the sort of promises of growth, the promises of prosperity, the promises of economic boom that the backers of that project had promised. And that's something that I think leadership in Pennsylvania should be held accountable for. They made promises, those promises didn't come true. And that should be a learning opportunity for leaders in that state, but it should also be a learning opportunity for folks in other places that are considering playing host to the petrochemical industry. If you're going to invite a big project to town, if you're going to subsidize it, if you're going to give it permits, if you're going to encourage that kind of development, I think it's quite useful to look at the performance of Beaver County to say, wow, is this really going to do what the industry is promising, or is a different outcome likely to occur. And with that, I'll call it quits. Again, Ben, thanks for putting on this webinar and running through the slides. Appreciate everyone for bearing with me during my monologue here, and I'd be happy to field questions.
Thanks so much, Eric. Yeah, please feel free to add questions to the chat or to the Q&A. We'd love to hear from you. And in the meantime, Eric, I'm curious about the learning opportunity that you just described. What would you hope that policymakers in Beaver County and elsewhere take away from Beaver's economic performance since the Shell plant? It's announced.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two. I think the first one is you should not take at face value what the industry is promising. The
Hmm.
industry has a very checkered track record of making claims about economic growth and performance that simply don't bear out in reality. This work, I should say, and I don't know if he's on the call or not, but this work was inspired by Sean O'Leary at ORVI, who did some really fascinating analysis of fracking counties and was sort of doing this post hoc look of like, well, what actually happens when you frack in a county relative to a county nearby that's not fracked? Turns out the economic performance is not in line with what the industry promises. So that's number one. But number two, I think the other thing that people don't do when they're considering playing host to a plant like this is, and this is because the industry wants it this way, they will only look at the positive side of the balance sheet. They're like, what are the economic growth opportunities? But they won't necessarily tabulate what are the economic impacts, the negative impacts from building a project like this, because there are substantial impacts. It occupies valuable land, it can create air pollution, it can create other nuisance, it can drive people away. And I think there's some evidence that that's happened in Beaver County. So thanks for the question, Ben.
Absolutely. Thank
Looks like
you.
we're getting some stuff in chat here.
Yeah, a few questions in the chat. The first is about any specific businesses that might have left or that may have come in since the cracker plant's announcement.
I don't know. We would have to turn to some folks who have more knowledge about the local economy to be able to
Mhm.
identify those. I don't know that anyone, and I could be mistaken, but I'm not aware of any businesses that said either A, we're leaving because of this plant, or B, we're arriving because of this plant. But perhaps somebody local has a better answer to that question.
Definitely. Thank you. We've got another question about rumors that Shell intends to sell the ethane cracker. Oliver asks if there are any economic implications for that reported sale rumor.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was reported, I think, in the Wall Street Journal and a couple of other outlets
Mhm.
late last year, if I'm not mistaken, that they were starting to look for a buyer for that. I think the economic implications are not great. I mean, they're so if for folks who've been around this issue for a while, you can probably recall that there was a time when the Ohio Valley was being sort of advertised as this it's going to be this petrochemical renaissance, and there were going to be five cracker plants and all kinds of development. That didn't materialize. Shell was the only company that built a large scale cracker facility in Appalachia in any recent period of time. So the economics from that plant probably aren't great from an industry perspective. I would suspect that if they're looking for a buyer, probably what happens over the long term is that the plant is not super profitable. Probably what that means is that it doesn't run at a full operating rate. Probably what that means is fewer employees at the plant and therefore less positive economic impact. And then I think there's always a risk as any facility moves kind of down the series of buyers that it's less and less well managed as the infrastructure begins to age. As you maybe have somebody who's less competent at running a plant than a big super major like Shell. I think more likelihood of pollution, other environmental violations. And so, and we see this in the refining sector, we see this in other industrial sectors too. But it's probably not great news that, just a few years after getting the plant operating, Shell's like, wow, this isn't such a good deal for us. We want to kind of cut our losses and get out.
Absolutely. Yeah, we recently published some related research that takes a look at the broader petrochemical market landscape and its implications for Shell in the context of these sale rumors. I will drop a link to that report in the chat here in just a moment. Um, but Eric, we also have a question about uh, from Sarah Hoffman, who asks, could you please break down in layman's terms the effect of Shell selling off millions in tax credits?
There are probably folks, maybe even on this call, who can answer that question. This report is very narrowly tailored at local economic impacts, positive or negative.
Mhm.
And so, what I actually tried to do by intention is to mostly leave aside questions of tax policy, mostly leave aside questions of industrial or corporate economic performance, and look really at what happens to a local area, what happens to a county, what happens to a community when this stuff is built. So all my research here is really focused on that. I I would love it if somebody who's on the call could jump in and talk about A, the tax credits, and then Shell's ability to sell those tax credits for their to drive their revenue. But I'm not the one to do that. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm afraid it doesn't look like Sean is with us right now. But Sarah, to your question, we that same report that I just mentioned, it does take a look at the tax credits that Shell reportedly sold off to a number of different companies, some of which are outside of Pennsylvania, some of which seem to be insurance companies. So I dropped a link to that report in the chat here. Oops, that's actually just to me and Eric. Let me send that to everyone. Um, but it explores in detail some of those tax credits and where they seem to have ended up since Shell received them from the state. Um, but Eric, another question for you related to these big tax credits. We're hearing reports of data center development coming to town. Um, in quite large volumes in Beaver County. Could you speak a little bit to what lessons Beaver County decision makers should learn from this research when considering carving out new tax credits for big development proposals like data centers?
Yeah, great question. I mean, everyone's talking about data centers pretty much everywhere in the country.
Mhm.
It's the temperature's high on the data center issue everywhere. But it is worth pointing out that Beaver County actually is a little bit of a special case because it's got a couple of projects, but the shipping port project in particular is enormous. Even by
Mhm.
national standards, it's a top 10 facility in terms of size and scale. So again, kind of Beaver County's in the spotlight. I think the lessons are. Be very, very skeptical about the economic promises that the industry makes. Of course, the industry, of course, the project backers are going to promise all kinds of benefit. The track record of those benefits actually materializing is slim, and it deserves credible independent analysis before any subsidies are awarded. If you're going to subsidize a project, let's say you have $1.65 billion of tax subsidies to throw away, like the Pennsylvania legislature did, you got to ask, what else could you do with that money? And you could do a lot of positive stuff with that money that benefits the local community in Beaver County. I mean, you can build any number of things with the effective amount of money of tax subsidies. And some of that local stuff, whether it's good schools, whether it's park infrastructure, whether it's police, fire, roads, all the stuff the infrastructure, physical and soft infrastructure that goes into supporting a community, that can often drive a very positive economic cycle in a way that a cutting ceremony at a big industrial plant on the edge of town is not going to do. Data centers do not employ a lot of people. Um, they do during construction, but afterward they don't. And they're quite resource intensive, as I think everyone knows. So there are significant concerns about water consumption and especially about gas and power consumption. In this case, it would be natural gas to produce electricity for the plant. So making sure that those costs don't land on local ratepayers, businesses and households, and making sure that the water consumption is not pernicious. There's a lot of stuff to worry about, and I think that nobody's really done a credible economic analysis of the local impacts of data centers. But I mean, it's awfully hard to see how it's positive for any community that's hosting them right now. And what you're doing is you're locking up a lot of land. You're getting some noise pollution. You're probably getting some light pollution. You're getting some complications to the local utility grid. As some folks have pointed out, including Sean O'Leary, who's not on the call. I wish he were on the call. He's pointed out that even a quote unquote behind the meter project still has the effect for a bunch of reasons of pressuring rates, that is electricity rates higher for local ratepayers. So lots of stuff to be concerned about. And I mean, what are the benefits to hosting a data center? It's minimal at best, in my opinion.
Yeah, thanks so much for that
Sure.
breakdown. I'll quickly plug that, yeah, ORVI itself, we've got some new research coming out on kind of the economic returns of what we're calling mega projects, things like data centers uh, that suck up a lot of public money. they produce questionable returns. There are other ways to go about generating long-term lasting prosperity, lasting job growth. And yeah, we're excited to be able to take a deeper look into that with some forthcoming reports. But yeah, please feel free to add any other questions to the chat or Q&A. Oops, I'm seeing one here. Let's see. Oliver says, the argument that it doesn't seem to have created a petrochemical boom seems strong. What is the evidence that it's made it worse? Is there any evidence that it is crowding out other business or local investments? There's some trend lines that seem to be going down before the plant's construction, and the slopes of the lines seem to be mildly less steep in some of the charts.
Yeah, I mean, Oliver's question is it's a super fair question. And the thing is, it's very hard, whether you're pro Shell petrochemical plant, whether you're anti petrochemical plant, to be able to attach clear causes to what's happening. So, what's the right way to parse this? Um, it is clear that at a macro level, especially looking across multiple measures of economic performance and looking at each of those measures in with multiple metrics, that Beaver County has not done as well as the state, not done as well as the country, and in many cases done no better than or often substantially worse than neighboring counties. Now, is that because of the petrochemical plant? Is it because of larger structural trends that are going on in the economy? Is there something weird about Beaver County in particular that's not captured in any of this conversation? Is there something, I mean, there are a million potential causal factors, but I think the right way to think about this is sort of to zoom out to the highest level and say, well, the industry made specific promises. They promised that there would be large numbers of jobs. They promised that there would be more businesses, more people, more employment, more GDP, and none of those things have happened. So maybe the decline has moderated in recent years and maybe it'll turn around. But even if it does turn around, we still don't know. Is that because of the petrochemical plant? Is that because of other factors? Is that because there's a great bike trail in the neighborhood? So, again, I would just say, like, nobody, whether you're pro-plant or anti-plant, really knows the answer to those questions. What we do know the answer to is that the industry made promises, they got subsidies, and the results aren't there. They simply aren't there. So, Oliver, like, totally fair question, but I just caution anybody to get too certain about drawing from conclusions about causal factors. It's often said, like, if you want to know who's winning or losing the game, look at the scoreboard. This is the scoreboard. We're like the industry made promises, they didn't materialize. That's the story, in my opinion.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. I've also just dropped a link in the chat to a report we published in t early 2024 that articulates some of those promises. It captures some of the promises that were made by industry, many of which were premised on an economic impact study that was produced by Robert Morris University several years prior. So yeah, would advise you to check that out if you'd like to just kind of see the picture that was painted of this economic renaissance that Eric mentioned earlier. Cool. Well, again, we welcome any further questions via email if they occur to you later. But thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. Again, we'll send around a link to Eric's slide deck. We've got some summary materials. We've got a link to the full report itself, which I'll drop in the chat here now. And again, send around with a copy of this webinar recording too. But we really appreciate you joining and hope you have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ben.
Take care.